Well, welcome everybody and online. Thank you, Robert and Rolf and all the fellows for having me here. Thank you to Kappas and to my fellow presenter, Dorothy. So let's just jump into it here. Okay, so yes, I'm pleased to start with this book here, Calamity Theory, 3 Critiques of Existential Risk, co-written with a friend, Derek Woods, which just came out a couple months ago from University of Minnesota Press. And when it came out, I also somehow my attention was drawn to Kappas, and so I pitched a visit so I could talk about this book. And I will be going through it. Oop, I gotta mentally adjust that this is my clicker. Okay, so this is our general outline for today. What is existential risk? Then I'll go through the 3 critiques, but just to give you a kind of very quick summary of them. The first chapter is a critique of, we can say, the discursive or the definitions and some of the basic kind of methods of what existential risk means as a phrase or a field. It's a kind of philosophy field. This is specifically what I'm talking about. Second critique is about probabilism and scientism in terms of how this field operates. And the third critique is about the word existential. What does that mean? What is existential philosophy, and how does it relate to existential risk? And then at the end, I'll give you some brief thoughts about apocalyptic thought. So how did I get into this topic? I've been working on for about, let's say, a decade on the broader maybe topic of extinction. I'm finishing a book called What is Extinction? A Natural and Cultural History of Last Animals. That hopefully will be out at the end of this year with Fordham University Press. And I was working on that. I have a few sort of broad thoughts about how we understand extinction. And I came to one overall thought that it's quite a paradoxical concept. So it's central to biology and ecology. You can't have biology and ecology without extinction, but it's also the end or the undoing of those systems, those processes. And it's been understood in many sort of sometimes diametric ways. So it's considered to be, we can say, disruptive and regulative at the same time. So regulative meaning it's normal, it's expected, it's statistically calculable, but also it disrupts all biological systems at the same time. So it's both systematic and sort of anti-systematic. In the language of 19th century naturalism, it's uniformitarian, which is another word for regular or unexpected, but it's also catastrophist, or overthrows biological systems. So you can add other similar binaries. We can call it both functional and apocalyptic, since that's why we're here. It's both measurable and disastrous. It's both evolutionary and entropic. And so that's what this broader research has been about. And also, the other thing I'm very interested in is, extinction when and where, which location, who's involved, how are humans implicated, how are animals implicated, and they're always co-implicated in every situation. And they're also deeply problematic in their co-implications. And in the larger projects I work on, I investigate some of these the conflicts and the larger historical problems of studying animal extinction and human extinction side by side. Broadly, we would find in every case of animal extinction, certainly, as well as human extinction, troubling histories of colonialism, racism, dispossession, and domination. So just to start with this quote from Winona LaDuke, White Earth Ojibwe enrolled member. She states that, quote, "There have been more species lost in the past 150 years than since the Ice Age. During the same time, indigenous peoples have been disappearing from the face of the earth. Over 2,000 nations of indigenous peoples have gone extinct in the Western Hemisphere, and one nation disappears from the Amazon rainforest every year. There is a direct relationship between the loss of cultural diversity and the loss of biodiversity." So my work has been to think about those connections and to understand them better, sort of case by case. But I'm going to maybe skip a little bit of some of this material on the slide. As I was working on this broader theme of extinction. I've also been reading a lot of the other sort of interests across the humanities in this topic. So extinction studies have grown rapidly in various fields in the humanities. I mean, I come from the English department, sort of philosophy and cultural studies world, and so there's been a lot of material in this topic in the last 10 years or so. Here are some books, for example, on the topic. And I'm always thorough in my research, and I started to read anything that had to do with extinction broadly, and that drew me to this topic of existential risk. And I jumped in and eventually decided it was really something separate. I should write a different book on that topic, existential risk, and even though it sort of intersects with extinction. And so I did, and I wrote it with my colleague, Derek Woods. So what is existential risk? Really, I think it helps to locate it with a specific person who really helped coalesce the field to define it and laid a lot of the groundwork, and that person is named Nick Bostrom. He is a philosopher at Oxford University, and his initial definition of existential risk is as follows. He says an existential risk is one where an adverse outcome would either annihilate Earth-originating intelligent life or permanently and drastically curtail its potential. And this definition comes from a 2002 essay called Existential Risks, Analyzing Human Extinction Scenarios and Related Hazards. And this essay really is, let's say, Nick Bostrom's foundational essay for the field, and essentially launches this movement or this field called existential risk, in which philosophers, and previously was pretty unusual for philosophers to deal with, major, let's say, existential crises or the end of the world or apocalypse. It's not always been a common thought, let's say, that philosophy, that's a domain of philosophy. But Nick Bostrom, I think, makes a very compelling case that it is. The question is how do you study it and what's the approach? What's the method? So in this essay, Nick Bostrom does list, he says, first thing we have to do is list what are the existential risks that are maybe near term, medium term, far term, and so on. So I list a few here. And this is the order that actually he offers in terms of importance. In this essay, he says deliberate misuse of nanotechnology, nuclear holocaust. We are in a simulation, a cosmic algorithm program run by some form of superintelligence, and it gets shut down, sort of Matrix style. He has a long argument about that, and it's quite fascinating, but not too important right now. A superintelligence of our own creation leads to our own undoing, a genetically engineered bioagent, an unforeseen physics disaster of our own creation, a naturally occurring pandemic, we're all familiar with that, an asteroid impact, and a runaway global warming, for example, on Venus. Okay, so these are all very important, but it's clear that in this list, some are speculative, some are, questions, are these actually possible? So they already raise, how do you prioritize? How do you understand? How do you make sense of this kind of list? And my book and my interest largely in the field is more about the methodology than the details of that particular list. Like, I don't have any expertise in nuclear engineering or anything like that, so I'm not helpful in that. But I am very much interested in how we approach these questions. And I'm sure everyone who studies apocalypse has that same feeling. What's the method? How do we approach it? What kind of thought processes will we use? Okay, so Bostrom's own work has become quite popular, and especially in Silicon Valley, it's spread like wildfire there. In particular, it has the attention of Elon Musk. So you can watch YouTube videos of them having conversations. It's very popular among other people involved in Silicon Valley. It also, so Bill Gates, for example, is a reader of this material. It's very popular on the podcast circuit, especially due to one person in particular named Sam Harris. There are other authors involved in this field, other thinkers like listed here, Sam Harris, Sir Martin Rees, Max Tegmark, Thomas Moynihan, and many others. And in the last sort of, let's say, decade, there's been developments, sort of institutionalizations of this field, somewhat kind of on the model of a place like CAPES. You could call these places, research centers like the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford and the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge. But I'm more interested in the ideas behind all these sort of fields, and they intersect with other interesting philosophical trends that are very contemporary, and those would include what's called long-termism, thinking, not just 100 years, but even maybe thousands or millions of years forward. So that's called sometimes long-termism. There's also utilitarian maximization, or just utilitarian social theory, ethical altruism, and various variations of transhumanism and posthumanism. And these are all coalescing into and in conversation with each other throughout this field of existential risk. But I come maybe not so much to praise this field, but to critique it here. And I'm going to start even with Slavoj Žižek, who has been here recently. And there's I think, quite perceptive quote that I take from him, where he says the following. He says about Silicon Valley, in the Silicon Valley world, right, every company is doing the impossible. So every company is there to triumph over the impossible. But if you want to make the world just a little bit better, that's truly impossible. So his quote, it says, you want to raise taxes a little bit for the rich? They tell you it's impossible because we lose competitivity. You want more money for healthcare? They say impossible. This means a totalitarian state. There's something wrong in the world where you're promised to be immortal, but cannot spend just a little bit more for healthcare. So I think this is a perfect sort of Silicon Valley kind of quote, and quite relevant to existential risk version that Nick Bostrom is proposing, where he is very much interested in immortality, maybe not so much about how healthcare can be improved just a little bit better. So anyways, I'll just say that, you can use this as a meme, just to riff on it a little bit. We're promised self-driving cars, but if you just want a little bit more bike lanes, maybe that's impossible. Although in Germany, maybe not so much. But in Canada, for sure. We're promised to be able to live on other planets, but if you want fresh water for everyone on Earth, well, that's impossible. Or, for example, again, we can live forever, but if you just want a little less plastic wrap on your products, impossible. All right, so anyways. So as I said, I wrote this book sort of challenging this field. And I'll just jump right in to the chapters. So the first critique focuses on the definitions and discursive decisions made by Bostrom. And if you notice his initial definition, an existential risk is one where an adverse outcome would either annihilate Earth-originating intelligent life or permanently and drastically curtail its potential. There's some really troubling things even in just initial definition. First of all, he doesn't mention actually humans. So the unit of primary concern is not necessarily people, it's Earth-originating intelligent life. And that could mean machines or human and machines together. He's open to whatever that means, various possibilities that means. And I think that's already should raise some questions. And in fact, what it really means to him is that he's already built a kind of utopian transhuman horizon into the definition of what an existential risk is. So he goes on in this very first pages of this essay, this foundational essay, to say that an existential risk must be global and terminal. He cites Derek Parfit, a well-known philosopher who has this argument that says if 99% of humans disappeared or were destroyed, that would be certainly terrible. But if 100% of humans were destroyed or went extinct, it wouldn't be just 1% worse. It would be infinitely worse because there would be no possibility of recovery for anyone, for any of humanity, and so all future possible lives would be lost. So that's why, for Nick Bostrom, global and terminal is essentially the core definition of an existential risk. And anything less than that he calls a local terminal risk or a catastrophe. And as he says in this essay, an example of a local terminal risk would be genocide leading to the annihilation of a people. This happened to several Indian nations. So we challenge this definition from the get-go. Why bother? Why set it up so that your threshold is so high for the definition, and all the other disasters of the world are sort of put at a lower rank. To me, that already is way too, it's too hierarchical, and it doesn't learn enough from all those disasters, all of which will inform us about what an existential risk is. Okay, so I'm going to maybe move a little faster, though I will read my Hannah Arendt quote here. Hannah Arendt will just say about genocide and totalitarianism that the project of totalitarianism is to change human nature. And she says, quote, "The concentration camps are the laboratories where changes in human nature are tested." So even by Nick Bostrom's definition, genocide, Holocaust, these are clearly existential risks. So we don't even need to debate that, even in his definition, but in his initial argument, it wasn't the case. So just to add a little bit more details about Bostrom's arguments and the way he argues is that he often uses what we call typologies. And essentially, he makes lists and summaries of the main ideas. It's as if when you're talking about apocalypse, you must be brief, you got to be no nonsense, you got to get to the gist, use lots of bullet points, like these PowerPoint style things. And he is effectively often uses these kinds of graphs here, which I won't go into detail about. My point is that I understand this as almost a criticism of philosophy. That philosophy is too slow, too much dialogue. He doesn't really cite philosophy or the history of philosophy much. He doesn't really engage in it, which is very unusual for a philosopher. And I think it's a problem of his work. It's a problem of the field. That it maybe doesn't even believe in conversation. Because they have a reason why. Because if any of these major disasters hit, maybe philosophy isn't effective. Maybe philosophy doesn't work to prevent existential risks. And if we really want to prevent them, then we need a better approach. So philosophy itself, it's really unusual for a philosopher to not maybe recommend philosophy in that way. I infer that's what he's doing. He doesn't say that out loud, but that's my inference. Okay, so practically, Nick Bostrom will say things like we need to have good governance, peer review, practical institutions that have oversight, public access, forms of deterrence, cooperation, things that we have now, and all of this will help us to avoid or prevent existential risks. On the other hand, maybe they won't actually help us as much as we hope, and if that's the case, then maybe all bets are off. You can imagine a nuclear scenario where there's no governments left, there are no politics left. So how do we think that? And he does these kinds of scenario planning. The truth is there may be no fail-safe resolution to any of these risks. And any technological or social, efforts to control or stop these existential risks, those too will have their own existential risks as well. All right, so on to our second critique together, and really I want to highlight the work of Derek Woods here. We question the use of probability. That is highly emphasized in a lot of existential risk research. In particular, for example, this book by Toby Ord called The Precipice. And Toby Ord, just to very briefly sum up the issue, estimates in this book that we have a 1 in 6 likelihood of human extinction in the next century. And that number, 1 in 6, became quite media circulated. And Ord himself is quite serious about the need for this kind of calculation. He spends a lot of time in the book doing that. And yet, there's so much guesswork in these calculations that it's hard to really say that this is science. But it has the ear of science. When you can give some numbers and some calculations, it gets the ear of science very fast. Now, that may not be a bad thing. It's good to have the ear of science. But it's not, I'm a little skeptical, too, that that's the right way to have collaborations between the humanities and science, to sort of make up statistical calculations. Okay, so then they do the reverse, where they believe that maybe, if you think about the long-term potential of humanity, it may be in millions of years, tens of millions of years. And they, both Ord and Bostrom, go on to say, well, maybe if we add up all the sort of possible good things that might happen, there could be 10 to the 54 power of future lives to be led. So a ridiculous number. So you have some very strange calculations on what the likelihood of an existential catastrophe is, as well as some very strange calculations on what an existential, kind of best case scenario would be. And we question both kind of approaches. So I'll just skip this quote there, but so just so I can keep on my schedule here. Okay, so we question the use of science and scientism there and that kind of probabilistic thinking. And then to get to the last chapter, we delve further into the word existential. Why that word? Why existential in the phrase existential risk? And we argue that reality is it's very surprising that nobody in the field is actually interested in the word itself, in existential philosophy and the history of existential thought. For them, existential is just a convenient synonym for threats to human existence or to existence generally. But we argue that actually existential philosophy as a tradition has a lot to say about existential risk. And but it helps to define what we mean by existential philosophy. So, we can quote Hegel, who not far from where I'm standing, argued that philosophy must not only understand substance, but also subject, or subjectivity. And then Kierkegaard builds on that, and he develops what he calls the subjective problem. So existentialism broadly is a theory of the subject, not necessarily though subjective or subject relative, but it thinks the features of subjectivity from both inside and outside, or first-person, third-person perspectives. It concerns everyday lived existence, as well as thresholds of existence, birth and death. But these are not just natural facts, but they're interpreted as conditions. So natality and finitude become interpretive sort of horizons for understanding existence, and so on. But also, it's clearly a philosophy which understands existence to be at risk, to be precarious, to not be guaranteed. Okay, so that's a very quick summary of existential philosophy. And if you look at the history of existential philosophy, you'll find many quotes and philosophers interested in apocalypse. And so it's really a philosophy field that says that philosophy should think apocalypse and respond to apocalypse, respond to the end of the world. So I don't maybe even need to read this Nietzsche quote here, but Nietzsche, for many obvious reasons, is very interested in that kind of approach. So I think once existentialism brought in the body and the life and death of the body into philosophy and said that this is as important as universalism, this is as important as logic and as other sort of bases of philosophy, that really broke open philosophy. And once you could talk about the body, you could talk about gender, you could talk about race, you could talk about the laboring body, you could talk about the contemporary world of what sometimes we call continental philosophy is. You could also talk about ecology, I think. So, so we make the case that you can't understand existence and ecology without thinking existentially. But interestingly enough, and to keep on track here, Nick Bostrom is not, there's reasons why he would not take this approach. And this is not his methodology. He is and avowedly interested in what we can call transhumanism. And that means eventually finding a technological, if it's solution or enhancement or a kind of acceleration towards superintelligence, so longer lives and advanced sort of cognitive capacities. And he thinks that's really the only way forward to really, let's say, resolve or get on top of the many existential risks that are out there. And we argue that, and so for Bostrom, while he's a very profound thinker of dystopian problems, he's also, we could say, a very profound thinker of utopian horizons. However, there's a debate about what that utopianism really means, because I think it's a vision in which the existential and the ecological become not what they are, not what we know them as. They become things that you can program, things you can design. And so we make the argument in this book that that's actually what we can say as a de-existential or de-ecological approach. So there's reasons why they ultimately, these are two different methodologies that we see. I want to say a few more words here about, bring up one last existential thinker, Hans Jonas, who did study at Heidelberg for some time. And he proposed in the book, The Phenomenon of Life, what he calls an existential interpretation of biological facts. So he wanted to bring existentialism and biology together. He eventually was very important in developing early ideas around bioethics. And then he wrote a book called The Imperative of Responsibility in 1979. And really, it's a book that talks about existential risks today. So it's very prescient. Actually, that book, I think, you can trace it to Capus, to some extent. And in that book, he argues that with the expansion of the scope of human agency, there's a new kind of ethics that implies. And he sums that up with a new categorical imperative. And that categorical imperative, I'm really quickly summing up here, would be, do not compromise the conditions for an indefinite continuation of humanity on Earth. Means don't do anything that would put the ability for there to be a future for humans on Earth into doubt or into question. And I argue it's not like an anthropocentric argument. It's much more about cautiousness and being humble and not engaging in extreme risks or even changing humans so that these risks can be solved at some extent. Because to do that, he describes that as what he calls compulsory or automatic utopianism, where you redesign humanity through biotechnological means to achieve these utopian ends. That, Jonas goes on, and it's quite long, and I'm just very quickly summarizing. But that, we don't have an ethical imperative to do that. We don't have an ethical imperative to be perfect, or to supersede humanity, or to be transhuman. We don't really even have an ethical imperative to be super intelligent. We do have an ethical imperative to care for the precarious, or to attend to suffering. And that's where we should be. That's where existential thought should begin, and existential risk studies should begin. So I will just conclude here with a few broader thoughts about the connection of this field to existential risk, to apocalypse thinking. In addition to all the existential risks we face in the next 50 years, we also face the risk of irrevocably changing our planet's existential structures. But there's no necessary reason for us to do this. To let's say, affix ourselves and our planet to some superior form of intelligence, even though that doesn't mean we don't need to be phobic about things like artificial intelligence or machines or anything like that. They can obviously be helpful, but to have let's say a cult of that, or to sort of think that's that's an obligation to develop that, I don't think that's the case. I want to also say that it's possible to think the apocalypse without thinking apocalyptically, since that is very germane to this audience. And by that I mean is that this isn't. I'm standing here delivering words. That's very anti-apocalyptic, right? We're talking about apocalypse, but we're not doing it, let's say, apocalyptically. By sharing ideas, by dialogue, by discussion, by critique. By developing the humanities alongside the sciences. To me, that's not apocalyptic, let's say, action. That's, let's say, anti-apocalyptic. So we can think about the apocalypse without let's say, being swept into it. That also just means that the way we talk, the methods, the form, the way we argue, and how we share our ideas is as important as the content. Or the sort of, even let's say the direct result of that. Finally, what I've learned from thinking about existential risk and extinction together is that we are constantly defining and redefining extinction, and we are constantly defining and redefining life and death, so generations and finitudes, and we should be doing that. That's fine. That will give us tools to be creative, to be participatory, to not be exhausted. To me, that makes the world safer. To be able to do that, that's how you deal with existential risk. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.